Today, I'm thrilled to meet with Rebecca Gordon, who is an independent researcher and writer in modern and contemporary art, specializing in the history and theory of contemporary art conservation. Rebecca also happens to be my departmental colleague at the UCL History of Art, where she has taught since 2018. She is also contributing to the Technical Art History MA curriculum at the University of Glasgow, and her research has addressed issues of authenticity, artist intent, material significance, documentation, and artwork's critical mass, and the conservation of socially engaged art. Really interesting and very, very engaging topics. Currently, she's working on a reframing of artist interview methodologies, as well as a new theoretical and ethical framework for art conservation as a counter-extinction activity. With Glenn Wharton and Brian Castriota, she's a co-editor of Issues in Contemporary Art Conservation, due from the Getty Publishing next year, hopefully, a volume which will become a crucial reading in the field. So Rebecca, thank you so much for making time for our conservation conversation. And here are my two questions. Can performance be conserved? If so, how? And if not, why? And the second question, what does it mean to conserve performance?
Thank you, Hannah. What rich questions you have put to us. And I think to begin with, it's important to address what we mean by these terms. So to think about what we mean by performance and also what we mean by conservation and to conserve that performance. So we could think about performance in many different ways. And I imagine you're speaking to many different people from different disciplines. Performance in the context in which I'm working and the people that I work with would be within the contemporary art context, and that performance would suggest an interaction with objects or people, with ideas. It might also be particularly fixed in a temporal moment. But I like to think of performance also, I think, as Judith Butler describes, as a choreography of these different aspects, a choreography of objects and networks and processes between both human and non-human actants. And that can take place in very different ways and different networks. So it's important to understand what it is we're talking about in terms of the performance. And that can happen in particular time, in a particular space, in a particular context. It could be a fleeting action or a prolonged interaction between these things. And so then the question is, once we've identified what this performance is we're talking about, or a performativity, again to invoke Butler, is how do we go about conserving that? And what does it mean to conserve that? And again, this, I think, Hannah, you alluded to a path that I'm following in terms of conservation as a counter-extinction activity. And it makes me think of the natural world around us, and what do we do to conserve, for example, an urban green space. And that might be very different to how we might conserve a bonsai tree, for example. So an urban outdoor space might involve rewilding, which means removing to an extent that human actant and that human actor as part of that, to allow nature to have a kind of process and those other actors involved, the pollinators, for example, to take over and things to change and to mature. Whereas a bonsai tree, for example, and I'm absolutely no expert on this, would need constant care, very particular environment, very particular circumstances, pruning, trimming, and a lot of interaction. So depending on what the performance is and how it performs itself, who is the performer, who are these objects and these networks part of this choreography, and how can they work towards the conservation of this moment or this act. And in terms of, we could call kind of social practice art as well, a certain amount of performance, that interaction with each other, with a community, with artists, with policymakers as well. And we might think about a certain network of power relations as well within that, and decision makers. And so asking what would that look like to develop that conversation over time, to try and perhaps document that performance, to document that interaction, and at what point does that then slip into an archive of that moment and of those interactions, and the document as a kind of surrogate of that moment. So when it comes to, I guess that leads into your second question, Hannah, about how you go about that, and as I'm sure many other people that you've asked will explain, that there are many different ways to do that, and depending on the context, if that is within an institutional context, if that is within, again, for example, social practice art, where there's actually the Social Art Library based in the UK now, for example, where they are asking artists to kind of document, to journal about the works that they are producing, and to have a record of that, to provide some kind of link and access point to that work by others in the future, or in a kind of wider audience, as it were. Because with performance, there does tend to be this particular moment of engagement. There tends to be that exchange between, let's say, the artist and the audience. And there's another question: does a performance have to have an audience? Does there have to be that interaction in order to be activated? And would it be okay to reenact, to enact that performance again in the future without an audience? And an artist that I worked with a number of years ago now, Aileen Campbell, for example, was part of her practice, and the works that she makes as a trained chorister, she's got a beautiful voice, was exploring how it feels to perform these incredible feats of endurance, for example, jumping on a trampoline while performing incredible arias, for example. So for her, to document that work, or to enable a certain essence of the work to continue, she was wondering about whether it would be interesting to document her heart rate, for example, through that, her variation in the pattern of her breathing as she becomes more and more fatigued throughout the performance. And then it might also be interesting to document the reaction to that sense of fatigue. So there's all these aspects of quantitative data that could be interesting as part of that performance, as well as the qualitative. And to me, it's the qualitative that is particularly interesting, and that kind of storytelling behind the interaction and both the subjective experience of the performer and those engaging in that performance is a really interesting aspect of how that work can continue into the future, how it can have, some people may refer to it as an afterlife of that piece, of that work, beyond that moment in time. So when we are talking about the conservation of performance work, we could think about, and has been written about, and I think Hannah, you may have also written about the aspect of notation for performance, because there's this desire, particularly within the tradition of and the trajectory of conservation as a profession and as a practice, to somehow try to delineate what the work is, to somehow try and quantify what it is, so that if we have this material aspect of the work, then there's something to pass on to future generations, to pass on to the future, to even have that within the collection, to have something tangible. And that's why sometimes performance work can be quite confusing and difficult for many, because there is this ineffable aspect to it, this quality, this intangibility to that work. And so various notation schemes, such as trying to score the work like a musical work, also using notation of choreography, dance notation, to try and map out the work. And actually, and I've written before about this aspect of trying to map a work, which I perhaps now wanting to contest more, because to try and map an artwork is to an extent trying to contain it, so that we feel we have some control over that. So I'm trying to think of an example, also in the way that we might have instructions for an artwork. And for example, you mentioned we teach together at UCL. With one of my classes, we enacted, reconstructed, we can talk about all the terminology as well, perhaps separately, some works from Hans Ulrich Oberst Do It exhibition work. And part of that project was asking artists to create instructions for works that other people can perform. And that can be something as simple as Yoko Ono's wish tree, where you write a wish and you populate a tree with all of these wishes. And eventually she collects these wishes over the years and has an enormous repository of these wishes now in Iceland. And so the act of the artist's instruction also has become something of a score for the work, again, to try and materialize the work. And that brings the question then, which we touched on earlier, about documentation and the archive. And at what point does the documentation become a surrogate for the work? Can it ever stand as a substitute for the work? And is it okay to have that as an access point? And Rebecca Schneider's written about that beautifully, and I think you've had a conversation with her, and which very much enjoyed. And she writes beautifully about that aspect of documentation and performance. And this is something that I'm working on in relation to social practice art, because are we missing something of that energy, of that interaction between the performer and the audience? And we have something of a very small insight of that during this period of lockdown that we've been having. Even during this conversation, the different kind of engagement that you have with colleagues, with performances, with theatres having to go online, than you would with that energy and interaction within the theatre space, within the gallery space, within community space and interaction with each other. And so the question is, within the field, the practice of conservation, which traditionally from particularly the Second World War onwards was rooted in this scientific methodology, rooted in the material aspect of the work and the idea of the authenticity of the work being inherently linked to the material and the aesthetic of the work. So when we're faced with artworks that really defy that, often purposefully evoking the temporary and the transitory and the having to be here to experience it, then we often find we're puzzled to know how to give that work a future. And the question is whether it needs a future, whether it's okay for that event and that performance to be a one-time momentary interaction, and how we can define or redefine the aspect of authenticity for performative and performance artworks is an interesting question that will be ongoing. The idea of performance potentially being for the present rather than the future necessarily. We might think of conservation as being a practice for the future, to preserve works, cultural heritage for future generations. We might even think about curatorial practice as being of the present and interpreting the past even. And so what is the practice for the future? And I think that's where the practice of conservation is becoming more and more reflective and reflexive, which helps the practitioner to be thinking both in the here and now and in the future. And it's that Donald Schoen talks about being a reflective practitioner, and for example, methodologies like Seneca Stitchgout talking about autoethnography and thinking about why we're making the decisions that we're making and the context in which we're making them, so that future practitioners can understand the context in which they're made, that there is no one size fits all for every artwork. And I think part of that future methodology in thinking about futures comes from a multidisciplinary and multi-methodological point of view, rather than relying on what we have used in the past and the tried and tested quantitative aspects of trying to pin something down, to pin down those aspects that we know, so that we have some sort of control and comfort over that. And it may end up, and I think the the whole practice and profession has been, over the last decade, been doing a lot of reflecting and rethinking, and I think there'll be a lot more of that to come.